Welcome everyone to another CTC software webinar. My name is Sean Zerbis, the Director of BIM Development here at CTC Software, and today I am excited to continue with you the series on CTC Analytics learning. In this session, we're going to be jumping into the web API pretty deeply, but focusing on sort of an easy entry-level use of that data with the Microsoft Excel and Power BI. So that's kind of the focus for today. Now, as always, we like to record our webinars, so you can go back and watch this again in the future as you're trying to implement this if you're not following along with us today. For those of you who are watching this on YouTube, on our YouTube channel, we hope that this particular session actually earns your subscription and your likes and all those things that we typically, talk about and do. Also, as always, for those of you participating with us live, I keep an eye on the questions window from GoToWebinar where we present this. So if you have questions about this topic or any of our previous Analytics Learning Series sessions, I encourage you to leverage that questions window, and I will try to answer your questions live in here. And where it doesn't fit for the live questions and answers, we'll also have a huge QA session at the very end after the first little kind of closing thank you. So without further ado, let's jump in and take a look at today's topic. So we've talked about this throughout this series. In the modern culture, data really rules everything. It is king. And having the ability to leverage that data to drive your decision making really helps you be more productive and direct all of what you're doing in much more appropriate directions when it's a data-driven decision as opposed to an emotionally driven decision that isn't really founded on actual facts. So we have here at CTC streamlined the content management system and project performance data logging. So all the data logging around users and groups, around the CMS, around project activity, around the license usage, all of that data logging happens automatically, very little effort. So in previous webinars, we've talked about kind of the stock reporting that's available from the portal. And that's sometimes good, but usually, and especially for those of you joining me today, I strongly suspect that's not good enough. You want more. You want further history, deeper access to the information. You want to do more advanced things with that data. And so in this session, we're going to be really deeply introducing the use of the web API. Last session, I introduced the web API's kind of core structure. We're going to be using that today as we actually extract data into Microsoft Excel as the data storage system, since that's fairly efficient. At least it's an early entry-level way of doing this. And then we're going to leverage Microsoft's Power BI toolsets to actually do some visualizations. And in the end, you're going to be able to leverage this data a bit more powerfully. Now, we're going to start easy and build in complexity as we go through this. So we're going to talk about a few things. We're going to talk about the analytics prerequisites. I'm going to repeat them from the earlier sessions. And if you haven't yet taken steps to get your reporting key, that's totally fine. You can absolutely go get that today. I'll show you exactly how to do that. We're going to talk about getting the data files that you're going to be needing for analytics if you want to just jump in with both feet and not have to do a whole bunch of pre-work. We're going to take a look at accessing that analytics data in Excel and viewing some reporting in Power BI. So we'll talk about some of the parameters there. Now at the end, for those of you who want to stick around and see a little bit more about the power behind all of this and how we really set it up, I'm going to introduce you to a bit of Power Query code. And so you can actually start to customize this and advance upon this if you really want to. And we're going to be building upon some of that Power Query concepts as we dig into next session's stuff in Python. Same concepts, different kind of code, but same theory. So where are we in this overall series? Because, I mentioned we've been talking about this for a while. So there's a whole bunch of topics we're going through. There's 8 total sessions in this series. So far, we've done the first 4. We talked about installing and configuring PAL so we can data log our project performance. We talked about the model management to organize that project data into logical projects. We've done the portal dashboards showing you early entry-level access of the information. And in our last session, we talked about getting started with the reporting API. Now, we're going to use that reporting API in Excel and Power BI. That's this session here. So let's recap a little bit of the API prerequisites. In case you haven't gone after this yet, now might be a really good time to get your hands on some of this information here. So API prerequisites, number 1, you need an API key from CTC for you to be able to get access to this. You're going to see in a moment here exactly how that key gets used and why it's really important. If you don't have that key, none of this is something you can follow along with. So I'm going to encourage you, reach out to license request at ctcsoftware.com. Let them know that you need a reporting key, and they'll be able to get you that reporting key pretty quick. So perhaps even while we're going through this today, you might have a reporting key in your hands. I'm also going to encourage you to get the stock files that I have for this. Get the data set that I'm using here. And I'm going to continue to use this data set and improve upon it as we go through the rest of this series. You're going to want to start with some of the sample code that I'm providing. I think it's going to save you a lot of time unless you're a really fast typer. So you're going to want to get the data set from GitHub. Wow, I misspelled that terribly. Wow, that's silly. Let me fix that real quick here in my PowerPoint because that's supposed to be GitHub. And let me just quickly cycle through that. There we go. And the GitHub repository here is github.com, Shanzi's code, CTC_reporting_API. Okay, so you can go get those files. Now, when you go get those files, there's two for today that are the most important. But if you already got some of these files last week, it's the same files. They haven't changed. I'm going to give you a quick tour of this real fast here. So we're taking a look at some of these prerequisites. That's the wrong page. Apologies. Let's pull the correct page forward here. This is my GitHub repo sitting right here. And in this GitHub repo, the CTC reporting API, and once again, you can see the path right here as well. In here, the API essentials is where you want to be focusing on for today. If you already have got the API essentials, that's the key. In here is two files in particular, PBIX, which is a PowerBI X file, and there's an XLSX. We're going to be using these two files actively today. If you've already got the Postman setup files, you don't need these again. Go and use your Postman account. We'll be using that later as we dig into some of the more advanced concepts of Power Query. We're going to be using that page. If you've already got that set up, fantastic. If you don't, you can just simply go get these JSON files. You can follow along with last week's webinar, last session's webinar, and import these JSON files here into your Postman environment and be able to kind of navigate through the different collections that we have available for you. So pre-built, pre-stock, save you a bunch of time in getting that all configured. So that's the GitHub repo here. We kind of recapped all that sort of GitHub, cloning of stuff in the previous session. We already talked about the Postman setup, and so you're going to want to be leveraging that. I think that will give you a good kickstart. But for today, the whole focus today is to talk about using that data. We're going to start easy. We're just going to update and use some of that data quickly. And then we're going to get a little bit more advanced a little later on. So first off, Excel file configuration. With that Excel file that's in there, there's a few things you're going to want to do with it. First off, you're going to want to put it into a safe place. Probably don't leave it in the original repository folder in case you want to let it get overwritten. I'm going to be copying mine to a new spot. Once you have it in whatever final location you want, you can open that up. And you may as well put the Power BI file right next to it. So you're going to open up the Excel file. Within the Excel file, we're going to navigate to Data, Queries and Connections. And from there, we're going to be using some of the componentry that's there that's pre-built for us. We're going to kind of collapse the primary queries because that's just going to take up a lot of space and save us a bit scrolling here. We're going to edit the parameter that's called report API key and put your API key into it. So you're going to enter your API key into that field. And then once that's done, you can do a data and a refresh all. I'm going to show you these exact steps. I'm going to go through them right now at the same time. So first off, I've already kind of copied my file here, the API Essentials, into a brand new folder. What I'm going to recommend that you do is take your Excel file when you make a copy of it and give it a name, like put your company initials on it. So I'm going to put CTC on this one. In fact, I'm going to put CTCE for my little Express Tools side company, the fake company that I use for demonstrating this from an end user point of view. So I'm going to use this file here today. I'm going to leave the default alone in case I ever need to reset and go back to it. In this CTCE file here, I'm going to open this up in Excel. And in here, we're going to follow those exact steps that I had just outlined here. Let's pull this off to the side. So it was open the file. We already did that. Data, queries. So data and queries and connections right here. So when you go to queries and connections, it's going to open a little side panel in Excel, and you may have never used these before. That's okay. But these queries over here, these queries and connections, they started from this little get data aspect right here, where you can pull data into Excel from some outside sources. And most specifically, I used originally the from web. I'm going to walk you through that process when we get to the sort of bonus materials near the end here. So within here, I told you collapse the primary queries here, and then in that report API key, you can just double click on that and that'll let you edit it. So I'm going to double click the report API key, which you'll notice right now is a whole bunch of zeros. I'm going to double click on this. Oh, yep, hang on a second. One thing I forgot is that Excel likes to, quote, protect you from stuff. So up here, because this has external content, this external connection currently has been disabled. And so for you to be able to use this Excel file, you will need to enable that external content. That's going to allow this to go out and query the web for information before we can refresh. So I should have put that in my steps, but you will need to enable that content. Here in the report key, I'm going to double click on this, and that's going to open up Microsoft Excel's Power Query Editor. There's a whole bunch of stuff inside of here, y'all. There's tons and tons of pre-built connections to leverage this data. But the only thing you need to worry about at the moment is the report API key right here. This key right here, when you get this from CTC's license request, the license request at ctcsoftware.com, you can take that key and you can simply paste it right in there. I'm going to go ahead and paste in the key that I have in memory here. And I'm just going to save, close, and load this into my Excel environment. So when I hit close and load, it's going to try to do perhaps a little mini refresh. Maybe it won't do a mini refresh. That's okay. If it doesn't refresh immediately, then we're going to use this data refresh all. So I'm just going to hit refresh all right here, and it's going to pull all of the information into this environment. It's going to go query all of the data, all of these primary queries, these 46 pages worth of information. It's going to go fetch all of that and load it into my active Excel file. This sometimes takes now 60 to 120 seconds, depends on how much data you've got. So we'll be coming back to this here in just a moment after it's done that full-on refresh. So we'll come back to that here in just a moment. First, though, we can talk about a couple of other things. I told you it took about 60 to 120 seconds. That's a minute to 2 minutes to go through and get that information. Well, we can actually refine this quite a bit. In the queries and connections, in that parameters collection, you can actually update how much time you want to go, how far back in history there is. There's a search date offset parameter, and if you modify that, you can change if it's going 60 days, 180 days, 30 days, 1 day, whatever you want. You can change that to whatever number you feel is appropriate. The further in history you go back, the more data it's going to be fetching for you. So that's going to take longer the more you go get. Now we're going to talk about optimizing that even in the future, in future sessions. But for now, in Excel, you have to collect a specific set of data to actually play with this. There's also some extra fields there. Get such and such a tables to control specifically what major collections of data are actually fetched in the first place. Some of you might not be using the project activity logger information. Maybe you're not using PAL. Maybe you're only using the CMS. Maybe you're not using the Hive product at all, and all you care about is your users and groups and your CSL, your cloud shared licensing data. Well, then you don't have to try and go fetch information if it's not meaningful for you. You can turn that off. And there's some parameters in there that let you just turn off the major table collections, the major settings inside of here. And we'll see more about what that means here in a moment, but you can then also refine some of those major collections of information by modifying the includes table to explicitly control exactly what subdata is refreshed in here. Now, by default in my file, it's refreshing nearly everything. But if you want to really limit that down and only go after some specific subset of data, well, man, your data is going to refresh a lot faster. If you're only getting 30 days of searches and project information, and you're only getting specific tables, but maybe you only care about some specific subtables, well, you can really make that whole data refresh significantly faster. Let's go see if this is done yet. Nope, it's still thinking. That's fantastic. So I should have probably had a pre-refreshed version of this, or not let it refresh all. When you hit refresh all, it grabs all the stuff. You can actually go into just the primary queries and refresh a little bit at a time. So because I don't want to wait for this to take forever, I am going to do one thing here. I think I'll let that refresh fully here, but I'm going to make another quick copy of this, and I'll start another refresh of this. CTC E, we'll call this number 2, and we'll use this here in for just a moment. So I'm going to open this up in Excel. There's no dialog box open. You're lying. All right, well, Excel's going to be a pill on me, and I should have checked to see how long that was going to take. So I'm going to close that. We're going to hard kill Excel today just because I don't want to wait for that to fully refresh since I told it to go after everything. End task Excel. There we go. We'll just reopen this back up again. All right, so enable content. We'll do the same thing. Close my document recovery. I don't need that. Data, queries and connections, same as before. Inside of here in my queries, we're going to go collapse the primary queries. We're going to go update this reporting API key, double click to edit it. And I'll put in the correct value here. Windows paste, grab that guy, and close and load that. All right, so my report key is up to date. That's good. Now I'm going to collapse that for a second and go to primary queries, and we'll go take a look at, say, users by organization here. Right now, there's only 3 rows of data loaded. What I'm going to do is refresh just this one table and let it go after the users specifically for my current org, and it's going to go and fetch that information now. And it has it nicely dumped here into this little table, into this little tab with actually a named table inside of here. It's ready for me to begin consuming this information, right? I could go after groups specifically if I wanted to. Right-click, refresh that, and have it specifically refresh just the groups. Now, again, if I want to sub-control what all this is going after, let's go back to that little PowerPoint here. Remember, I can update which tables specifically to go after, which major collections of data. So in this Excel file here, underneath the parameters area, there is get accounts tables, get CMS tables, content tables, CMS search details, right? There's some specific sub tables that I can go after. And if I wanted to modify this, like maybe I don't want to get CMS data, let's say CMS tables. If I double click on that, I can modify that value for the get CMS tables right here to be false instead of true. And if I do that, then it'll just skip any of these things inside of this list that are prefixed with CMS. It will go get nothing for any of those. It'll just be all basically blank or have dummy data inside of it. So if you don't care about CMS stuff, you just set that to false for the CMS tables overall, and it won't go after it. Or if you weren't doing the project activity log stuff, you could tell it don't go after the PAL data, and it will turn off the PAL. If I turn off, if I go back to here and say get PAL tables true, right? If I say false on this one, when I data refresh, now it's not going after the CMS tables at all. It's not going after PAL tables at all either. It's going to be just going after effectively the accounts and the cloud shared licensing. So for those of you only interested in that, you can quickly turn those off. And that'll save you a bit of waiting. All right. For those of you who are interested in that, of course, you're going to want to make sure those are set to true. Now, I was mentioning for the other aspect here, the includes to control what subdata is referenced, okay, subdata. If I go back here, there is a table that's called includes right here. And there's a, for each of the different scopes of information, accounts or CMS or PAL or whatever, there's specific collections of data within there, groups or content-specific properties or search-specific collections of data. And then there's certain properties over here saying, for CMS content, do I want to include files? And right now, this is saying true, go after that. But it's saying false, don't go after the attachments or don't go after the downloads. You can modify these values here in the includes table to set true or false for any of these if you want to go after more or less data. And again, the less you go after, the faster the information that you're trying to refresh will refresh. So you have full control over that. The final one that I didn't point out yet was this one here, the search date offset. How far into history do you want to go to collect your data? By default in this file, the search date offset is set to 60. Now you can drop this list down. You can go 1 day, 30 days, 60, 180 days. You can go as far back as you want to go. In fact, you can even type in values here if you really want to, but the suggested fields are these. I would recommend in Excel, probably don't go back further than 180 days. You are probably going to be waiting quite a while. There's a lot of information that exists inside of here, and the more search data you try to go after, the longer it's going to take. And if you really want to go beyond 180 days, and some of you may, that's great. That's what the future portions of this web series are going to be talking about, how to go even further back in history sustainably and make it a much faster refresh. We'll be talking about that in future sessions. For Excel, though, you can go back quite a ways. 3 months, 6 months, that's quite a lot of time to go back 6 months and store all that data in Excel. So certainly be cautious with this. Excel does have limits on how much data it can store, but you can certainly modify these properties. And then when you ultimately save this file and refresh all of your data, that information will be there for you at your fingertips. So in my case, I'm going to go ahead and close this out. I'm going to keep my changes here that I've modified inside of here. Again, I didn't refresh all of these queries inside of here just because I didn't want to wait for all of it to take time to refresh, but you absolutely can do a refresh all when you're ready to do that. For now, I'm going to go ahead and hit save on this. All right. Now, the next major step here is to update your Power BI file configuration, okay? When you update the Power BI file, that's going to link to this Excel file. The Excel file is kind of your data storage. I used to have this set up. For those of you who have seen this presentation in the past, you'll know I used to have Power BI actually be the data store and reporting engine. The problem is Power BI is an absolute rubbish data storage system. It is not a database. It's very slow, and the data refresh takes forever. It took like 20 minutes for the same exact data set to refresh in Power BI for just like 30 days, as opposed to now in Excel, I can usually refresh in about 2 minutes when I'm not presenting on a webinar. I can refresh very quickly for 180 days usually, and it doesn't take that long. It refreshes very quickly, and it's much more consistent. Okay, so how do we get the Power BI file to update and point to the Excel file? Well, what we're going to do is ultimately open the Power BI file wherever it is you have it saved. We're going to go to Home, Transform Data, and Edit Parameters. And there's a single parameter inside of there. It's called Excel File Path. And all you're going to do is update for the path of wherever that Excel file is stored. Now, I typically put them in the same directory, so I can just copy the path of where, whatever the directory is I'm in and replace the Excel file with that path. Now, it does need to include the Excel file name, so I'll show you a little trick you can use to get this copied. And then ultimately, you're going to hit OK and refresh, and the data in Power BI will refresh very quickly because it's just referencing a little local Excel file, and that makes it pretty quick and easy. Okay, so let's go through this exercise here. I'm going to take my Excel file, or my Power BI file rather. I'm going to make a copy of it just like I did the Excel file, just so I have an original copy sitting out here. I'm going to steal the name from my Excel file that I was working with, this one here that I just saved today, and I'm going to paste that into here just so the names are matched up and I can know which one is supposed to match up with which. I'm going to edit this Power BI file here. Simply double click on it to open up the Power BI file. You will have to have Microsoft Power BI Desktop installed. If you don't have that, it's free. Technically, you can go get it for free, and you don't have to have a license for it to try this out today. There are some things you do need a license for Power BI for, but with this file, you really don't. You're going to be okay. Inside of here, once again, the steps were, let me minimize this here. Home, Transform Data, Edit Parameters. So Home tab, Transform Data right here, Edit Parameters. There is only one parameter. It's called Excel file path. There's a default path here for this. What I'm going to do is copy the path from my Excel file out here in Windows. Now you could copy the path from here and then manually type in what you did for the name, but there's a cool little shortcut you can use, and that is hold down your Shift key and right click on your Excel file. When you do that, you get a custom option that shows up inside the right click menu. Shift right click will give you access to this little thing here, copy as path. Copy as path lets you get the entire path, including the file name of this file, and we need that entire path for this to work out well. Okay, so here in the edit parameters, now I'm going to go to the home. I'm going to use the home key here to get to the beginning of the line, use my Shift key, hit end on my keyboard to get to the end of the line, and I can just erase that out. And what I'll do is paste in that path. Now, trick here, there's a trick here. When you do copy as path, Windows puts quotations around the path. There's a double quotes here at the end and a double quotes at the start. You need to get rid of those double quotes, both the start and the end. So I'm going to be deleting those out and just leave the path. Now, it's okay if the path has spaces. That's all right. It just has to have whatever the path is to that Excel file, including the name of the Excel file in here. Then you can hit OK. And you can hit apply changes. And what this will do is basically rescan all of the data that's currently saved in that Excel file. Whatever's saved is what's going to get pulled into here now. And it doesn't take very long at all. It actually pulls that information in really quite quickly. However much you've got, it usually takes less than like 10 seconds to pull that information in. Because once Excel is the data store, Power BI becomes lightning quick for navigating through that information. Now in Power BI, you have all of the same main tables that you had in the online web portal. In fact, the web portal was modeled after this, but you also have more, and you have the ability to make whatever you want. So you're starting with the same thing that's on the web portal here. If you were to go to something like users and groups, if I control click this, it will take me directly to my users list. And here is all of my user information from that Excel file. Now this has already got some filters baked in for just my active users, or I could go to like disabled users or whatever it is I want, but I can go see all of that information there at my fingertips and begin to navigate through these users very quickly from different aspects here in this environment, right? Now in that last data refresh, I didn't include the roles for my users. That's not included. I didn't refresh that table. So it doesn't have that information here ready for me to use. If I go back to Excel and I say, give me the user roles, if I refresh this real quick here, it shouldn't take very long. It should pull that up pretty quickly. And if I was to go to groups roles as well and refresh this information, I can refresh this as well. I'll now have my groups up here, my group roles, so all the roles that are associated. I'll have my users for my organization and my user roles. I can also go get the group members if I want to and refresh this information. So this I'll know exactly which users by ID are within which groups. And this goes and pulls me however many records there are. I have no idea how many there are. 75 records for users and groups. So if I resave this Excel file now, back in Microsoft Power BI, if I refresh my data once again here, it'll relook at that Excel file, repull the information, and now, once this is done in a few seconds, I should have, yep, there's all my roles. So I can say, well, who in my organization who's an active user is an organization admin? And I can see the exact users who have that type of role, right? This makes this incredibly efficient here in navigating through your data. Same thing on accounts groups. I can see what users are associated to which groups, say myself. What groups am I in? And it'll tell me exactly the groups that I'm in, and it tells me the exact roles that I've inherited from those groups, right? Tells me what department I'm even in over here. I got that information. Now there's other data out here, like maybe I wanted to know some stuff about CMS content. I don't really have a good content tab. Yeah, I do right there, Revit content. Well, I didn't refresh that information, so this is currently empty. Or maybe you don't have any information. This might be empty for you. That's okay. It's just empty data. Until you actually refresh and fetch that information, this will be empty, and that is fine. All right? So that's sort of the core of this. You're going to be updating the parameters in this Excel file with the reporting key for your organization. Once you've done that, you should be able to refresh your data, either one by one or overall. Now, before you update this reporting key, if you haven't yet put your reporting key in here and it's zeros, and you try to refresh, you're going to get nothing but errors in all of these tables. It's not going to be able to refresh anything because the 00's reporting key is invalid. It's not going to give you anything. You have to use your reporting key. So push your report API key in there. You're going to, again, double click report API key in the Excel file. You're going to go to, that value and dump in your reporting key, save and close that, save your Excel file, and then you can start refreshing data and you should be all right. Should be good to go. Should pull back information no matter what. It should start pulling back information. Now, again, if you're getting errors in some specific tables, that's okay too. Maybe you just don't have any data. You can set that to false so it won't even try and fetch it. And that's okay. What a lot of my customers will do with this when they've got early access to this Excel file is they'll go into the CMS tables, perhaps the PAL tables, maybe even the cloud shared licensing table, and they'll set those 3 to false so they can just start looking at their accounts tables, their users and groups and things like that, and get the initial data. So if you were to do that, once again, CSL tables, right now it says true. I'll set that to false. All of these tables are false. In theory, if I save this and I refresh all, this should actually refresh pretty quickly now, because really all it's going to go after is just the accounts tables here. So I'm going to let this chug for a minute and refresh. I did see a comment that some individuals were getting some errors about that data, and my suspicion is the report API key hadn't yet been updated, and that might be why you're getting errors. You do have to have a valid report key. The 00 is just there for a default, and you're not going to get much otherwise. All right. I'm going to let this chug through and refresh. This is going through. You can see it kind of flickering down here at the bottom, probably as it's pulling data, and it's giving me a count of 6. And once this is done, my little spinny wheel should go away, and I should be able to actually select inside these tables here in a little bit. So we'll let that go. All right. Let's jump into a little bit of that bonus information here. For those of you who really are disinterested in learning about the more advanced aspects, we've kind of covered the core basics, and if that's where you want to stop, I totally understand. But for those of you who want to dig in a little deeper, you want to see, how did Sean get this Excel file to pull all of this data from that Postman environment, from that web API environment? I'm going to show you some of the steps that I took to do that, and also introduce you to some of that Power Query content that exists within the Excel file that you have your hands on right now. Okay, so how do we work with Power Query? There's a couple of core steps. The first major step is to start with an intentional get data action, whatever that might be. In Excel, you can use the get data function. You can use some web API. Now, for those of you who want to just dabble and use this for financial information or whatever, right? If there's a web API out there, CTC included, you can use this get data and you can go get information from the web and throw it into Excel, and it's not that hard. So you start with the get data function. Later, you're going to investigate how that was written automatically by Excel when you use the automated functions. You're going to go investigate this in the advanced editor within the queries and connections. And then if you're going to be doing this step repeatedly, especially for something like CTC's API, where there's like multiple pages, multiple tables and subtables to go after, you're going to start by replacing common variables with a parameter. You saw me today have you replace the parameter for the reporting API. That goes through all of the individual tables and it injects that value into all those tables. And this way in the future, if for some reason you're asking to like maybe have your web API key reset for some reason, we can do that. We can help you get that replaced, and then you only have to change it in one place instead of going into 47 different queries and modifying it 47 different times, which isn't very efficient. And then within there, as you're working with that initial get data and you take some steps, maybe you're going to go get some user data or some groups data, you'll notice that a lot of the steps are actually quite the same. And so you can replace a lot of those repeatable steps with what's called a function. And that way it automatically does the thing repetitively. And if you make a change to the one function, it'll update all of those 47 tables and how they initially go get that data. Now we are going to go take a look at how that actually works here. So you can see how you can go through and build up your own data set from any web API, CTCs included, by starting with get data, investigating the connection in the advanced editor, replacing some common properties with parameters and making it a bit more dynamic, a lot more dynamic, and then replacing those repeatable steps with a function and actually building out as many tables as you need very, very quickly. This is pretty much the exact steps that I went through when I was first building up this Excel file, but you'll have an understanding as to what some of these steps actually look like. And then we're going to kind of pre-prep some of the knowledge that we'll be using in the next session where we start digging into Python and using Python code to do the exact same thing, but outside of Microsoft, so that we can have a lot more power and a lot more capabilities. So over here in Excel, you'll notice that my refresh has completed out here. It's actually got quite a bit of data now, actually pulled into these different tabs, the roles, the groups, the whatever. It refreshed everything because, well, it was only refreshing the accounts, and that was it. So in order to do these steps here, I'm actually going to start a brand new start from scratch Excel file that has no data in it. We're really going to start from scratch and go through these steps. Step one, again, is get data. We're going to start by getting some information. Now to do this, we are going to go to last week's presentation, and we're going to take a look at the Postman collection here. Because with this is where I'm going to figure out what kind of pathing it is I want. And I'll start easy. I'll go here to accounts. In accounts, in the reports, there's this get users by organization call right here. And if I'm in here taking a look at it and hit send, it's going to come back and give me 62 users. All of the items inside of here will have all of their data, right? I mentioned last week, if you click on this little code button at the far right of Postman, that'll actually tell you the exact URL that it's going to. HTTPS, API, ctcsoftware.com, accounts, reports, blah, 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 blah. Here's the reports key that you're going to inject inside of there. What page you're on, how big the page is, all kinds of stuff, right? It's writing it for you. I'm going to copy this, and I'm going to use this exactly in Excel to have Excel fetch this information and show it to me in a reasonable table instead of showing it to me in sort of this long JSON file stream, right? Because this isn't quite as readable. I want to look at this in sort of a table format. So how does Excel translate this? Well, I'm going to jump into Excel, into this empty Excel environment here, and I'm going to use the get data command to, well, go get data. So from data, there's this get data, and there's a couple of different ways you can go get information, and one of them is actually from the web. Again, you can use this on any data source you want. You want to go to Yahoo Finance and use their web API to get financial information? Go for it. Get from web. You can pull the data directly into Excel and refresh it whenever you want. So I'm going to use this, and I'm simply going to paste in the exact URL that I copied from Postman. Everything about that URL, just paste it, and I'm going to click OK, and I'm going to let Excel go out to the web and get me the information. And here it is. Users, reports key has some ID value. It has some other options right there. It's telling me what it went after. Tells me it got 62 items, and those 62 items are currently in a list. And there's a couple of things I can do with this. I can take this and turn it into a table right here. I can take this table and I can do something called transpose, which takes the first column and turns it into the table headers, and it takes the second column and turns it into table rows. So I'm going to transpose this. I can take this first column or first row right here and turn this into the actual headers, since these are the titles. So I'm going to use the first header or first row as headers. And now I've got the items here of 62 items and a whole list of things. I can expand this open here in Power Query. So I can expand that list into new rows. So it actually builds a row per item in the list. So it gives me a bunch of records. And I can expand those records out. Each of the values can become column headers here, and just click OK. And now I've got every single user from that whole data set up on the web in Excel. And I can even do things inside of here if I really want to, like filtering down this list to only show me active users maybe, and that's all it pulls into the table. So I just went through and from the web pulled a bunch of information. Now that was a lot of steps, right? I can back all of this up out here. I can undo all of that and just go through it again. There's my web. I went and got data from the web and I pasted the URL. So that was step one. I took this information and just used the base convert. The only command I can really do with this data now is to convert it into a table. So I'm going to do that, convert into table. That makes this into columns and rows. So I'm going to then take those columns and rows, transpose it so that the first column becomes the sort of the top of the table, and the second column becomes a row underneath it. That's called transposing. That puts the named columns into sort of a headers position and the data values as a sub piece of information. I'm going to use the first row as headers. So it's going to replace column 1 and column 2 with total items and items. And then finally, I'm going to expand this list into individual items from the list as new rows of values. It gives me all of the individual records. There's a whole bunch of data wrapped up in these records. I'm going to expand those records out into their individual data fields. Now, if there was some information you didn't want, totally fine. You can simply uncheck the values you actually don't want in there, and it will then throw those data values away and show you just the information you want. You can kind of scrub and clean that data very quickly if you want to. So that's how I go through and I get this information. I'm going to go ahead and click OK, and it's going to give me then all that data. And again, you can further filter this if you want to by filtering down. After you've expanded that data, you can filter down inside of here, and you can sort, and you can do whatever you want with the information in sort of this query environment before you even throw it into Excel as a tab. Now I'm going to rename this. I'm just going to call this accounts users right here, just so I can identify this very easily. It'll become a tab name out here when I'm all done. So I'm going to go ahead and say close and load, and that will give me accounts users out here, and I've got 25 rows of data. Now total items I also didn't need. That's kind of silly to have 62 listed over and over again. That's the total number of users. I'm filtering that down to just actives. So I probably didn't need this column. I could have deleted that as well. And we'll take a look at how to do that. So that was sort of part one, right? I went through the exercise here of starting with an intentional get data command, and then I used some of the built-in commands in Power Query in that sort of query editing window to build out how accounts users is fetched, filtered, extracted, all of that. That's part one, right? Next, if I want to kind of do some more powerful things and not have to go through those steps one by one manually each individual time, I can investigate what this is doing in the advanced editor within that queries window. And that's what I'm going to do next. I'm going to double click on accounts users here. That's going to reopen the Power Query editor window here. And within this, for accounts users, I can click on advanced editor. Now, this is just a series of sort of commands. There's nothing super magical really happening. All these buttons up here are doing is running a command, putting some code into this Power Query window and giving me the ability now to edit it in this advanced editor. So if I really wanted this to do something a little bit different, well, I could take a look at this URL and begin replacing some things here, like this reports key. If in the future I decide to change my reports key and get a new one because maybe it grew legs and somebody else has access to my information. I don't want to have access to the information. Maybe I would want to centrally change this from someplace. I don't have to keep changing it over and over and over again. To do that, I'm going to build a parameter and use that parameter within this code and have that parameter inject a value right here. There's some other things you can do with parameters as well. For example, if we go back to Postman and take a look at how these URLs are built up, you'll see some very specific common things that are built into this URL. Let's go take a look. Here in Postman, if I'm on the accounts collection here of stuff, you'll notice that in this route, it says accounts, and then it has reports, V1 reports, and then it says users, because I'm in this little users kind of collection of data as well. If I go to groups, it's very similar. Accounts, reports, V1 reports, groups, and then it has reports key with a reports key right here. And this, by the way, is also a parameter. This parameter is being injected from the environment we set up last time. This is automatically pushing in whatever that reports key there is supposed to be. Invited users or role values, right? Accounts, role values, reports key. The structure is very, very similar for this. Let's investigate another one real quick here. Cloud shared licensing. If I expand this one out, there's get licenses by organization. Well, if I click on that one, it's instead of accounts now, it says CSL. But then it says reports, V1 reports, just like everything else, and then it's licenses and reports key and some other stuff. But this here is the only thing that changes to get me a different collection of information, or this here within that collection to get me a different scope of information. So this is now very repeatable for all of these different things that I want to go after, all the CMS stuff. Let's see if this is consistent as well. CMS, reports, V1 reports, contents. So from this, if you kind of have an idea of what you're going after and what some of the required or optional fields are, it's very easy now to build up something that's very repeatable, very dynamic that you can go after. Let's see how we can do a little bit of this. Let's build out the reports key real quick here. If I go back into Excel and I go into the Power Query environment here, I'm going to tell this that I want to make a new parameter. So while I'm in Power Query, I can go Manage Parameters, New Parameter. And this lets me build a brand new parameter. You can give it whatever name you want. For me, I'm going to call this report key. Doesn't really matter if you put caps and smalls or spaces. That's up to you. I like to keep it all one word, and I like to kind of keep a similar structure to what Postman does out here, where it says reports key, right? Lowercase first letter, capital for every other word after that has some kind of meaning to it. You don't have to follow that nomenclature. It's not really that important. I just like to because it helps me keep my brain straight. So I'm going to basically do that. Reports, plural, reports key. This is text. It has to be text because it's going to be put into a big string eventually. And so if I click OK on this, I'll have to give it a current value as well. Let's for now just paste in my reports key here that I already have in memory to save me a little bit of headache here. So reports key. So I'm going to have that value just kind of sitting out here. Now this is going to get real muddy real quick in this list with everything kind of all bundled together. So personally, I like to create little groups of information. Like I have my main tables of data inside of here. I have a new group here. I have parameters. And we'll get to know others in a minute here, but my accounts users is one of my primary tables. And so this guy I'm just going to drag up into the little tables grouping, and the reports key here I'm going to throw into parameters. And that's just to help me keep my brain organized. That's the only reason I'm doing that. It's not required. You'll see that in the other file that I have that I've kind of grouped that way as well. So here, this reports key now has a value. And if I go to accounts users here, I'm going to show you with the advanced editor how we can inject that parameter into the query. So advanced editor. And over here where the reports key value shows up right here, this is how we can work with this. If you've ever done any concatenation in Excel, there's a little trick you can do. I'm just going to hit enter here a couple of times so I can show you this. In Excel, you can go equals, and you can do some quotes. You can put in something, and then you can do an and symbol, and you can do another set of quotes, and you can put in, else, whatever. And what'll output from this, ultimately in the cell, is actually something else. No space, because I didn't put a space anywhere in here. I could put a space before this. That would put a space before this. This is space, please. Anything? Space. There we go. So this is what Excel does for very simple concatenation. Cool thing here in the advanced editor in here in Power Query, it's exactly the same. So what I'm going to do here in the reports key is I'm going to take this value that's sitting here right now, just the reports key value, and I'm going to put quote, quote, give myself some space here, an and symbol on both sides of that. And then in the middle here in Excel, if I wanted to concatenate two cells together, I would give it the cell reference, right? A1, something like that. Well, here in Power Query, I'm going to give it the name of the parameter that I made. So reports key. And in fact, it even helps me out by popping that up. All I got to do is click it. And so it will take this first string. It will concatenate the reports key value, whatever that value is. And then it will concatenate this ending part on here as well. So if I hit done, exactly the same, no difference, identical. It is the same. Now, there's other things that I can do as well. I can cheat by stealing some of the other things inside of here. Remember, if I wanted to go reports groups, I can make this a parameter as well. But I don't have to make it a parameter here. I could put it as a parameter right inside of here. Like right after the let, I could make a new thing. I could call this out as, I don't know, scope, and make that equal something like users. And then instead of putting it here inside of a long string that sometimes is a little bit tricky to have to go figure out where things are, I could replace this with, again, just scope inside of here. With or without spaces, it doesn't really matter. Now it's yelling at me here. It's got a little red undersquiggle because I didn't properly tell this what I'm doing. You notice here at the end of every one of these lines, when there's another line after it, there's a comma, and I didn't do that. If I put a comma here, then I can make this so that this becomes, a value, and then this builds upon that value here in the next area. It uses the scope, and it pulls in reports key from an outside parameter. Cool thing is if you mouse over these guys, it'll even tell you what the values are that are coming through. So it tells you all that data. You can get pretty complex with this. You can add a bunch of extra stuff inside of here. Now the important thing about this in particular is that now if I wanted to leverage all of that, I could simply copy this. And I can, let's just paste it right back here. And I'm going to call this out as, let's get rid of that. I'm going to rename this guy and call this groups. And I'm going to advanced editor this guy. And I'm going to change this to groups. Now, I think this actually re-referenced itself, to report key 2, which is silly. I don't want report key 2. I just want reports key, the original. It made for me an extra one because when I copied the table, it copied that as well. We're going to find a way to make that a little easier in a moment here. But if it's also going to yell at me because when I expanded out all of those columns out there, it doesn't have first name, last name, status on groups. So this isn't going to work very well, but we'll come back and sort that out in a minute. When I click OK here, I'm going to delete the filtered rows. I'm going to delete the expanded items here, and I'm just going to re-expand these records and pull in the correct fields here. So all the fields that relate to groups in this case. And now I've got my groups data in Excel. And if I ever decide to change my reports key, totally fine. I can change my reports key whenever I want because both users and groups will update based on this same reports key here. And I think I can now delete this guy because it's no longer actually in use, right? You can continue this theory on and on and on. That's great, right? So that's part 2 here, investigate in the advanced editor, and then replace variables, things that change, with parameters. The other thing that you can do is you can replace repeatable steps with functions. Things that you do every single time, you can replace with a function. Now, what would that look like? Well, in Excel, once again, over here, if I go to users, and I go to the advanced editor, you might notice that all of this right here, all of this is all the exact same, identical, every single time. It's going to go get the source from the URL. Actually, this even is the same. It's going to get all that information. It's going to transpose. It's going to promote the headers, same thing as before. It's going to collapse or expand the items. And then only after this does it do anything special where it turns those items into explicit discrete columns. So I could take all of this bit right here, all of this actually, and turn this into a function inside of Power Query. And that function then can be used over and over. And if I change what I'm doing here at the core, I can have these tables all automatically update in the same way with the same core functions so that they all begin with the same base stuff. To build a function, what I'm going to do is I'm going to basically strip this back just a little bit here. I'm going to actually have this just use the expanded items. So I'm going to delete the filtered rows. I'm going to delete the expanded items. I am going to delete total items here. I don't need this, so I'm going to do this step right now. So I'm going to remove this column and just leave the records in here. And this, up to this point, is what I'm going to make repeatable over and over again. So if I go to the advanced editor, I'm just going to copy all of this. Copy it all, and I'm going to show you a little trick that you can use to build yourself a function. So I'm going to make a new group. I'm going to call it functions. And by the way, once I'm done with this step, I'm going to be jumping into the Excel file that you have, and I'll show you some of the advanced things that were done there as well to kind of give you an introduction to how that works. I'm going to build a brand new blank query. So far, everything that I've been doing has piggybacked off of me using the get data function, and I'm copying code that it wrote for me. Now, what I'm going to do is I'm going to build a brand new blank query completely from scratch. I'm going to give it some kind of a name. I'm going to call this get X items. I don't know how many I'm going to get. So get X items, get some things, get something. And I'm going to open this in the advanced editor, and you're going to see just a little bit of core stuff sitting out here. It has the core structure of any Power Query. Let something do something, and then in that, give me back whatever the last item was. That's what this basically is saying. Let all this data do a thing, and then return from all that data whatever it is I want to return from that data. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to build up just a little function that's going to be able to be reused by accounts users and accounts groups, and for that matter, anything else, so that I can go after as many tables as I want very quickly and very easily. Within here, I'm going to paste underneath the source all of the stuff that I've already done. I'm just going to indent this just a little bit so you can see. So it's letting the source equal something, and there's a special thing we're going to do here that's going to tell it to repeat all of this code and then give it back to something else. This is how a function is structured inside of Power Query. The source is going to equal a couple of parameter values, a couple of inputs that it's going to use inside of this code here. Scope is one of the items. I'm actually going to be replacing the accounts right here with probably collection. So let's just do that now. And collection. And I put that in the wrong place again because I can't type and look at the screen at the same time because reasons. So, and collection, so we've got that. And I'm also going to do one other one here. Well, we'll put them up here so you can kind of see this. So we'll say collection, and I'm going to tell it what kind of value collection is. It's text. And then I'm going to tell this here that I also want to have scope as text. And I'm going to have what I'm going to call switches as text. And the switches are going to be all of the items. What did I mess up? Text, T-E-X-T, there we go. And all of this is going to be basically forwarded on into this next little piece of command over here. It's going to use these properties and dump them into here so that I can actually use it. That means I don't need scope users anymore. That can go away because that's just a little property that's going to get pushed in as one of these values. So I've got collection, I've got scope over here, and I'm also going to tell it that I want all of this ending bit right here to be switches. And that's going to save me a bit of extra headache and length right here. So I'm going to go ahead and say switches. I'm going to cut this, X, switches. There we go. And we're going to kind of collapse this down a little bit. So I'm basically just doing this to cheat a little bit and shorten up a lot of this information. I'm going to have one other little mini item in here, URL equals, and it's going to be all of this. I'm just doing this so I can shorten my screen so you can read all of this a little bit more easily here. So now I've got a URL with a collection, whatever I pass in, which is going to be things like accounts or CSL or you name it, whatever the scope is that I'm trying to fetch, whether that be users or groups or whatever. And then if I have any switches, it's going to concatenate that on the end as well. Now, I say if, I have to, I can make this if I really wanted to optional switches, but I'm going to make it actually mandatory. So for now, it has to be there. You'll see how I use this a little later on. So my source is these three values. And then within that source, it's going to push those into and return back this data to the end user. When I say get a certain number of items, it's going to go ahead and do that. When I hit done here, that is a function. And if I put some stuff in here, like CMS and contents, this is stuff that you can get from Postman. And the switches, maybe I want to have page equals, oh, I have to put an and here, and, there we go, page equals 1, and I forget what it's called. What is it called? It's called in Postman. It will tell me page size. That's what I'm looking for. Page size equals something. So I'm going to put page size on there. Equals 1,000. If I invoke this, it's going to build me a brand new table, and it's going to go get me some items, except for it failed for some reason. Because I put something in wrong. CMS, oh, because I misspelled contents because I'm great at spelling. That's why. Let's delete this and try again. Delete that, and we'll try this one more time. CMS, contents, switches equals, and page equals 1, and page size equals 1,000. I can call that up, and now it's going to give me all those records. So I can use this in users. I can use this in groups. I can use this wherever I want to use this. So if I go back in here, instead of having all of this garbage going on, I can replace the vast majority of this with calling that function, which is get X items, and I can tell it exactly what I want. So I'm going to say collection if I could spell, collection equals accounts. Come on, accounts. Scope equals users. And then finally, if there's any switches that I want inside of here, and I'm going to cheat by pasting all of the switches that I copied earlier, all of this stuff here, just because I've already got it in memory so that for users, it knows to go get roles and all the other stuff that I want it to go get. And it's going to leverage those as the collection, the scope, and the switches inside of getXItems. So I'm going to call this function getXItems, just like I actually did here. I could have looked at the stuff and you would have seen it do the exact same thing, but it's going to push into that the collection value of accounts, the scope of users, the switches of all this. It's going to automatically build the URL, and then after it fetches that data, which shows up in this sort of table environment, when I expand this out, it's going to turn all those records into whatever it's supposed to be doing for this particular call here. So let's go ahead and say source. I want to just return this value. So I'm going to say done. It shouldn't look, oh, I didn't put the right name in. I has to be capitalized. In Power Query, things are very case sensitive. So if you do put in lowercase, you have to make sure you use that lowercase again, because lowercase collection is not the same as capital collection. So you do have to make sure you use the exact same case over and over again. Try this again. There's my records. And now I can expand this out and have it get me all my data. So it's the same end, but the difference is if I wanted to change that original core for accounts, users, or groups, or whatever, I can do that pretty easily. So if I go to groups, I can do the same thing. In fact, I'm just going to copy the users aspect here and just copy all of this and paste that. Oops, did I copy the right thing? Advanced Editor? I did not. I missed one. I wanted to get this as well. Copy this, and I can dump that directly into accounts groups. And this way, this code up here, this little thing becomes a lot shorter and is very repeatable now. So paste that in. And in fact, I'm going to cheat by just not actually having it expanded out. I'll just expand it out manually once in this case. So in source. Done. There's my groups. I misspelled something. Accounts, groups. And I don't need the order by. That's just silliness. And I don't need that trailing comma. There we go. And you can now expand out the group. So now what, if you wanted to use this in the future, you saw me already invoke the function to get my contents for CMS, or I could use it for anything else. I can just use this function to build my next table out, whatever that's going to be. You want cloud shared licensing? You can go get CSL, and the scope would be, what do we want for that? Cloud shared licensing, get licenses by organization. So I can tell it to go ahead and get that from licenses. That's the one. Copy this. That should be all I need. Yep, and my page and page size elements, those are going to be the same, 1 in 1,000, just like I've been doing before. So I could just use that in this next little query here. So scope is licenses, page equals 1, page size equals 1,000. Invoke that, and it should go get me my licenses. So I could then just rename my table and say, well, this is CSL licenses. And I can expand this out, get all my data from my individual products and what my licenses are, and I'm done with that table. That makes this now really quick and really easy to go fetch a bunch of information. Okay, final step. I'm going to actually take a look one more time at that Excel. Oh, and by the way, when you okay that out, all of those automatically become distinct individual tables out here. They're all ready to go, and you can leverage this now immediately in Power BI. All right, final little step here. I'm going to reopen that original Excel file that has all this stuff going on out here. We're going to talk about one more small advanced function since we have some of the core concepts kind of under our belt a little bit. Again, this is recorded, so you can always go back and take a look at this again in the future. If I go into queries and connections, I go grab any of these primary queries, just double click to open up the Power Query editor. There's another way to get there. I don't remember how though. But inside of the Power Query editor, you'll notice that I have just a ton of those tables already pre-built out for you. So if you were to go into something like doc sessions and go to the advanced editor, you'll see the source equals a function. Actually, it's another table. I'm referencing another table called pal doc sessions raw values. And I'm expanding all the data values, and then I'm doing some extra stuff inside of here where I'm actually changing data types in some cases. In other cases, you might see some adding of custom fields where I'm doing some data conversions. I'm taking the open duration from seconds and turning it into minutes to make it a little more readable for you. Taking file size, which is in bytes, and turning it into megabytes, right? Just some data translations there so that it's a little easier to read. So it's basically the same thing that we've been doing though. If we go take a look at the PAL doc sessions here, the PAL doc sessions raw table is sort of a transfer table. There's no tab in here for that. And that's because I've intentionally not included it. If I go take a look at PAL raw, doc sessions raw, just sort of the basic pull of data, inside of here, there's a bunch of extra stuff going on. Super advanced. Why is it super advanced in here? It's because I've baked in some theory in here as well. I'm telling it to get the values only if you've told it to get PAL tables. If you remember those little parameters up higher that said get PAL tables, true or false, well, I use that in here to decide what to do. If you do tell it to get PAL tables, if that's true, then what it does is it goes and fetches the data for real from the web API. Otherwise, if you set that to false, then what it does is it just throws in some dummy data inside of here. And it becomes stupid information that's not really linked to your project information at all. It just does this so that Excel can truly go fetch your information, right? So just make sure you're setting the true or false correctly here. There's some other tables inside of here that are transfer tables as well. If I go to a slightly more advanced one, like the CMS raw full data table here, and I go to the advanced editor, this one has a couple of variables that it's pulling. It's looking at that includes table that I mentioned. It's looking for the field called include files. And from that, it's pulling back and giving me the value include files here. So that's why it's getting me trues and falses for each of these. So it knows from that whether or not it's supposed to, for the switches inside of there, whether or not it's supposed to be doing those particular includes, right? It's just building me a switch list. Include files, true or false. Include attachments, true or false. So that way it knows what to go actually fetch. Those subtables later on, they're also told, hey, if you're told to be false, then put dummy data into the table so that it can at least fetch and not fail. So that's an important step. Sometimes you have to handle that when Excel is told don't get information or get dummy information. The web API doesn't understand what that means. And so all I'm doing is telling it if that's false, instead just put in dumb manual data if it's false, right? And so you'll see that a few times throughout some of these tables inside of here. One other thing that you'll also see is I'm referencing these bigger tables. And this way, my Excel file only has to go ask the web API one time for a huge amount of data, and it pulls down all of its sub-data. But like, for example, in this collection here, the attachments for a particular piece of content, well, that's going to potentially be a bunch of items. That has to be stored in its own Excel tab because it's not going to look good on just one big tab. The downloads for a particular file or the files that are associated to a content record, there's going to be multiple files associated if you're using the CMS. If I go to the right, how many times has it been loaded into which documents has it been loaded? That's going to be a big table as well. And so every one of these columns here is actually a table up here. You'll actually see that. CMS content loads, right? That is a particular table here. This gets extracted into its own table. The revisions, the tags, the content files themselves, content file checks, like all of those are individual distinct tables up here, or could be if they aren't already. And you can leverage those as a tab out here. So we'll be using sort of that similar theory as we go through and do this in Python later on as well. One final thing that I'm going to talk about before we close it out today. Within here, I have a couple of functions. Remember I said get X items? Well, that's the same thing as my get next X. I have a few extra properties inside of here over and above what the one that I wrote up simply in today's little session has. I have scope, I have collection, I have page number as a property, a start date. This is important for any search information. An end date, again, same thing, important for search information. Any additional switches, and if there's an ID for a particular piece of content that's required, that's also able to be passed. Some of these are actually optional. So things like start date, that's an optional field. End date is an optional field. So some of these are not optional, and you actually have to give it some of that information. But with this, one thing that I want to re-point out is that in here, if I say, go get me all the contents for my company, this has a limit of how many it can get. The page size maximum is 1,000. That's the most you can possibly get. If you put 2,000, it's not going to let you get it. So if you have more than 1,000 items, total items, more than 1,000, you'll have to go and fetch additional pages. So page 1 has 1,000 objects. Page 2, if I go send this, has another 1,000 objects. Page 3 has another 1,000. Well, you know there's 7,500 elements here. That means that I'll have to go through to get all of them 8 total times. Once for page 1, page 2, page 3, page 7, which will be 6 to 7,000, and then once for the remaining items out there. So with that, I have to find a way to continually cycle through and go get each individual page over and over and over and over again. The way that so far this has been working in Excel is if I was to tell this to go take a look, this is my invoked function for my contents. Are you going to work? Oh, I have another page up. Yep, I do. Let me save this here. Save and close. If I go to this was my contents page, and I never expanded the items. But if we scroll to the very bottom of my contents, notice how there's 1,001 items here. That's actually 1,000 items because it never did promote that header. Well, it did promote the header. It's called items, but I didn't expand it out. There's only 1,000 items here. But I have 7,500, 7,600 complete total pieces of content, and I want all of them. So I have to find a way to continually cycle through and build up a full list of the 7,500 items. How do we do that? Well, once again over here in Power Query, if I go open this up, I have another function that partners with this. So my getNextX function, this is very similar to what you saw before. I'm telling it, here's my parameters, great. There's a URL, and I actually have a URL function that builds my URL as well, because there's different, some of the other things have, like if I provide an ID, it has to do something a little bit different, right, with that ID. So I have a URL function that builds that up. My source is effectively the returned elements. There's all my items right there. It just returns the items back to the user when they're asking for the get X items or get next X. But then there's a companion function here. It's called get all X's, get all of the items here. It's the same sort of parameters here, or an optional ID. But what I'm doing here, and what you might want to do as well, is I'm basically going and getting a page count. So I go and get the first list of items, and I figure out how many items are there. And so I have a total results number. And based on that, if my total results is greater than a certain number, then it'll just continue to get the next X. So right here, you'll see get next X. So it says total results equals, if there's nothing already there, if you have no results yet, go fetch some items. And then what it'll do is it'll say, well, if the current page that you're on, the current page you just fetched, is less than how many total pages you're supposed to fetch, go get the next X. And along with that, include all of the results you have so far. So it'll just continue to build upon it and continue to get the total results until you have all of your pages. If you want, you can take a look through how this is actually fetching this information. I encourage you to dig in a little bit to this, but this is basically looping through. This is a what we call a recursive data fetch. So it'll fetch just the first few rows, then it goes and figures out what page you're on and how many pages total you have, gets the first set of items, and then continues to get additional items and additional items and additional items as much as it needs to go fetch. But this structure of this function is actually very similar to what we wrote before. There's a source with some properties that you can pass in. It does something with data and gives that data back to the source and then returns that to the end user. And then this is used in a lot of the other data fetches. Okay, that's a lot to take in. I get it. There's a lot of information. We're going to go over that whole recursion concept again in Python code next time as we start to pull this data down in another way for those of you who want to dig even deeper beyond the Excel data and do even more with your information. All right. So with that, let's just kind of quickly recap where we are in the series. We've talked a lot already about different ways of storing your data. This session here was about a bit of custom reporting via Excel. We went deep in the weeds on this one on purpose to actually pull extra Excel data, leveraging PowerBI and all of that. The next session, we're going to be doing something similar, starting a little bit from scratch, using Python and harvesting that web API data down to JSON files. We're going to start kind of a little bit easier, a little bit more sort of primitive. You will want to make sure you have some familiarity with the Python programming language for that next session. If you come in completely blind, you will be lost on this one. You're going to want to understand a bit about Python, know how dictionaries work, know how Python language structure works, because we're going to be using it, not teaching Python essentials to harvest JSON data. Again, we're going to be focusing on the CTC web API. Okay, with that, for those of you who stuck around to now, I'm going to say thank you. We always appreciate when you participate with us live in our webinars. If you are watching this as a recording, thank you as well. We hope you found this meaningful. The great thing about recordings is that you can go back and re-watch information. So thank you for this. We are looking forward to seeing you in future CTC webinars as well.